Why is the world this broken? Here's the thing. God gave his creatures something dangerous, real freedom. And it didn't just go wrong once. It went wrong 3 times, and we're still living in the wreckage. A lot of the ideas in this episode come from Michael Heiser's books, The Unseen Realm and the Supernatural. If you want to go deeper than what I cover here, those are the 2 to pick up. Bible references are paraphrased in my own words rather than quoted directly. I will point you to the verse so you can look up the exact wording yourself. A quick recap from earlier episodes. So far, we've said Eden wasn't the whole earth. It was God's own home base, the spot where heaven and earth actually touched. The rest of the world was good, but still unfinished, still waiting to be shaped. Adam and Eve's job was to take care of Eden and then push that same order outward into the rest of the world. Being made in God's image isn't really about doing something. It's more like a title or a status. It means you're God's representative. And that's not just a human thing. The same idea applies to certain beings in the spiritual realm too. So God's representatives on both sides, the visible realm and the invisible one. Then sin messed all that up. Jesus is the one who actually lives up to that image perfectly, and he is the one who makes it possible for the rest of us to get that standing back. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 puts it like this. Jesus reflects God's glory perfectly. He is basically God in print in human form. And he is the one holding everything together. After dealing with our sin, he took his seat right next to God. And that's the backdrop for Genesis 1:26, where God says, "Let's make humanity in our image." The idea is that God has always run things through partners, heavenly ones and human ones working together under his authority. If part of bearing God's image is being his representative, then real freedom has to be part of that too. Think about it. Love, loyalty, sacrifice, betrayal. None of that means anything if you can't actually choose otherwise. Here's a simple example. A thermostat reacts to temperature, but nobody praises a thermostat for keeping the room warm. It's just doing what it's built to do. Now picture someone who is being very, very hurt by his best friend, and he chooses to forgive them anyway. That only means something because they could have chosen to stay angry instead. Real love and real rebellion both require the option to go the other way. That's the same logic we apply to angels and humans. Both being made in God's image means being built for real choices, not running on autopilot. But that freedom is risky. If beings can genuinely choose, they can genuinely also choose badly. And since nobody but God is perfect, that freedom can go seriously wrong, which according to what we are going to talk in this episode is exactly what happened. So here is the question. Why is the world such a mess? Why is humanity capable of so much cruelty? Why does evil seem plunged into everything instead of just occasional bad luck? Most Christians would just point to Adam and Eve eating the fruit in Genesis chapter 3 and disobeying God. Let us just say that's not the whole story. Drawing heavily on Heiser's ideas of how ancient readers understood their own scriptures, the author argues that there were actually 3 rebellions that broke the world, not just one. The first one was Eden in Genesis chapter 3. The second was the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4. And the third is the Babel in Genesis 11, connected with Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9. Each one left a different scar or consequence. Eden gave us death and got us kicked out of God's presence. Genesis 6 spread corruption and moral decay. Babel split humanity into fractured, warring, idol-worshipping nations. The first rebellion in the Garden of Eden. The plan was for God's two families, heavenly beings and humans, to live together, all under God's rule. And let us be careful here. God knew rebellion was coming, but that doesn't make him the one who caused it or make him guilty for it. And from that point on, the Bible's whole story is God working to bring people back into the family, not giving up on his project. The immediate fallout from Eden was death itself. Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, cut off from being close to God and from the tree of life, which was the source to give us the eternal life. What was supposed to be uninterrupted closeness with God turned into a life that ends in death. The second rebellion comes from Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. The strange, short passage about the sons of God and daughters of men, or human woman. These sons of God are as heavenly beings who crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross, and their offspring helped spread corrupting knowledge and moral collapse right before the flood. The third rebellion is in Babel, from Genesis 11, tied to Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9. Most people think Babel is just that's why there are different languages, but it's actually a much bigger deal. An organized, deliberate revolt against God. God's response was basically to let the nations go their own way, which led to idol worship, division, and a lot of suffering. But God still kept a rescue plan running underneath it all, through Abraham, as the story goes on. Put all this together, we need to learn that Jewish readers back in the Old Testament era, and a lot of early Christians too, expected the Messiah to fix all three problems at once, to solve death from Eden, to undo the corruption from Genesis 6, and to heal the division from Babel. Let us talk about the original rebel. Genesis 3:1 introduces the character who starts the whole thing off. A serpent described as more crafty than any other animal God made. As Dr. Michael Heiser says, this isn't really a story about snakes as animals at all. In the ancient world, serpent and dragon imagery usually symbolize something guarding a throne or a sacred space, a being with real authority and access to the divine. That's the image the story in Genesis 3 is using. This serpent is a supernatural being present in the Garden of Eden, God's own home, not a random reptile. Let us have a look into two Old Testament prophecies that seems to be talking about human kings but slip into a language that goes beyond them. Ezekiel 28 starts off addressing the king of Tyre, calling out his pride. That king thinks he is basically a god sitting on God's own throne, even though he's just a human. But a few verses later, verses 12 and 13, the text says this figure was in Eden, the garden of God, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. No human king of Tyre was ever literally in Eden. So we say is that the prophet is comparing the king to a much older being, a real supernatural figure whose downfall the king is echoing. Isaiah 14 does something similar with the king of Babylon, comparing him to a being called Lucifer, son of the morning, who fell from heaven after trying to set his throne above the stars of God and make himself like the Most High, and who instead gets thrown down to the pit. Tying this back to the divine council idea from earlier episodes, this rebel wanted to outrank the rest of the heavenly beings and even challenge God's own position, and he opposed God's plan to bring humans into the family too. Worth noting, when this figure talks to Eve in the garden, he hasn't been kicked out of the council yet. He's still hanging around Eden, which is where the council was said to meet. And what about that famous image of a dragon getting thrown out of heaven with a third of the angels? That image actually comes from Revelation chapter 12, a much later passage tied to Jesus' first coming, not a direct scene from Genesis 3. Satan isn't always a proper name. The Hebrew word behind Satan basically just means adversary or opponent. And a lot of the time in the Old Testament, it's more like a job title than someone's actual name. In Job 1 verse 6, when the heavenly beings show up to meet with God, the Satan shows up among them too, acting like a prosecutor, someone whose role is to test people or bring accusations. This job of Satan in the Old Testament isn't always the same picture of the villain being that later Jewish and Christian traditions built up. And what is really going on with the word serpent? The Hebrew word behind serpent, nahash, is doing more than one job at once. It can mean a snake, but it's also connected to divination, reading omens, and to something shiny or bronze-colored. Rather than picking just one meaning, the author of Genesis 3 is deliberately playing with all of them at the same time. Kind of like how the English word spring can mean a season, a coiled piece of metal, or a jump, and a clever writer can let more than one of those meanings echo, depending on the context. Read that way, this figure, the serpent in the garden, isn't just an animal. He is a guardian of the throne, a source of secret or forbidden knowledge, and something with a radiant, almost divine appearance, all wrapped into one word. The curse, the promise, and where the fight begins. Genesis chapter 3 tells us the consequences of the decision Adam and Eve made in the garden about the proposal that Satan or the serpent made to them. The ground itself gets cursed because of Adam. From that moment on, growing food means painful, sweaty labor his whole life, right up until he dies and returns to the dust he was made from. But this punishment to the ground doesn't cancel Adam's original job of ruling and tending the earth. It just makes that job exhausting instead of easy. Then comes the actual expulsion. God sends Adam out to work the ground he came from, and stations cherubim with a flaming sword at Eden's entrance to guard the way to the tree of life. What used to be a calling turns into a very rough chore. And this is the turning point. God doesn't walk away from his original plan. Genesis 3 verse 15 says that God tells the serpent there is going to be ongoing conflict between the serpent and the woman, and between their offspring, and one of her descendants is eventually going to crush the serpent's head, even though the serpent will wound him first. That's as the very first promise that the story isn't over. Someday, someone from the human line is going to undo what the rebel did. Humans still have to deal with death, but God's plan to eventually fix the plan of Eden and deal with the rebel is already in motion. The expression, her offspring, is pointing to humanity in general, eventually narrowing down to one specific person, the Messiah, the Son of Man. And the serpent's offspring means people who end up siding with the rebels' agenda instead of God's, which we can connect to Jesus telling some of his opponents in John 8:44 that they are acting like their father, who is the devil, and to Judas getting called a devil by Jesus in John chapter 6 verse 70. Finally, the curse on the serpent itself, crawling on its belly, eating dust, isn't really about snake biology. It's a picture of humiliation. The being who wanted to rise the top gets shoved to the very bottom, cut off from God's presence and from any seat at the heavenly table. Interesting to note that although Scripture describes the world as living under the effects of a curse, it never says that humanity itself was directly cursed. In Genesis, after Adam and Eve's sin, God declares that the ground is cursed because of them, not the man or the woman, meaning the environment becomes hostile and human life is marked by pain, toil, and death. The serpent, the divine rebel, is the one cursed, and later, after Cain murders his brother Abel, the curse again falls on the ground, not on humankind as a whole. Paul explains that creation is subjected to futility and groaning, showing that the curse affects the world system rather than placing a direct curse on humanity. The world is shattered through the rebellions of Eden, the Watchers, and Babel, not because God cursed mankind. The closest the Bible comes to saying people are cursed is Galatians chapter 3 verse 10, where the Apostle Paul teaches that those who rely on the works of the law place themselves under a curse, not because humanity is cursed by nature, but because rejecting God's way of restoration leads to spiritual bondage. And why any of this matters to us today? This curse is round one of a much bigger, longer fight, an actual ongoing conflict between good and evil, playing out in both the world we can see and the one we can't. The claim isn't just evil exists somewhere out there, it's that there is real personal opposition to God's plans, woven into the story from chapter 3 of the Bible, alongside the promise that God wins in the end. At the same time, it's really clear that none of this makes God responsible for evil. He gave angels and humans real freedom, and He didn't force anyone to rebel. Knowing ahead of time that Adam and Eve would fail isn't the same as making them fail. God already had a plan ready to go, but the choice and the blame for it was theirs. There is a practical point buried in here too. People love to blame their bad behavior on their upbringing, their traumas, bad influences, or even Satan. Those things can be real, but you still own your choices. Nobody else made you sin. And this reminds me of a scene from an episode of the TV series Suits, where Harvey tells Mike that even under pressure, he still has a choice. The point is that responsibility does not disappear just because the situation is difficult. In the end, the person making the decision still has to own what they choose to do next. And right alongside that, we can point to the gospel as proof of how God actually responded to human failure. Not by giving up on us, but with Christ dying for us while we were still sinners, as Paul puts it in Romans chapter 5 verses 6 through 8, which we see as the clearest picture of how far God's love goes even for people who don't deserve it. Let's conclude by saying God doesn't need evil to get anything done. His plans move forward despite rebellion, not because of it. And honestly, we can't fully explain every bad thing that happens, because we're only seeing part of the picture. The visible part, while a whole invisible side of reality is going on that we don't have access to. Then there is one last question. Why doesn't God just end evil right now? The answer is doing that would mean wiping out every imperfect representative, angels and humans, which would basically end the entire setup God chose from the beginning, ruling and sharing life through real partners instead of puppets or robots. God's not confused or stuck. He has chosen the slower road: redemption, discipline, patience, and eventually full restoration. It's compared to a parent who keeps loving a child who is gone off the rails, still correcting them, still sticking around, still hoping for them to come back, instead of just cutting them off. God wanted beings who could love Him, not beings who had no other option. God's answer to all three rebellions is one big plan: redeem humanity, restore what Eden was supposed to be, and put an end to all the grief that rebellion caused in the first place. The picture at the very end of the Bible, in Revelation, is God Himself wiping every tear from people's eyes, with death, sorrow, crying, and pain all gone for good. Revelation chapter 7, verse 17. And this war against evil is real. It's still going on, and it might get darker before things finally be brought back into order.